the CMO role is one of the more challenging roles for sure. And yet the recognition and understanding is still low.
Today, I'm speaking with Karl Bergh, CMO of Gigamon, a cybersecurity leader with a focus on deep observability. That's the technical term for looking at network security from the outside in.
Can the metrics jeopardize strategic thinking? They absolutely can.
Are there lessons from the pandemic that you can apply to a potential recession?
You've got to be sensitive where people are, and coming across as too marketing-y in a challenging time actually backfires.
How do you balance short-term results with longer-term thinking?
If you take the short-term tactical view, you will make short-term tactical decisions and you will not come out stronger from this economic crisis.
If we just focus on essentially what is the most clear, what is the most direct way to measure how fast we're climbing the ladder, and that's ROI, do we just forget to think about if the ladder's on the right wall at all?
One of the things I would be looking to do as we head into the downturn is how do I
And welcome to TOPCMO. I'm chatting with Karl Bergh, CMO of Gigamon. And Karl, one of the maybe starting points for our discussion that I'd like to talk about that you've thought a lot about is this difference between short-term versus long-term thinking as a CMO and how you balance the two. So maybe as a starting off point, how do you balance the short-term and the long-term? And I think in our discussion, we'll see how that has implications all throughout different decisions we make at various inflection points of a company's life cycle.
Yeah, great question, Ben, and great to be here with you and speaking to you, your audience. So it's a great question, and the marketing has evolved a lot over the years. And one thing I think we can say that is true, irrespective of the type of marketer you are or the company you're in, organization you're in, is that it's become more and more measurable. And that's good and bad. I'd say the good is that we can attach more easily the value to the outcomes of marketing. I think that's something that has been more of an art than a science prior. And now with all the data we have, it's become very clear, or it's easier to measure that output. So that's a good. The bad is that sometimes those metrics and that output, particularly, what is the quotes return on investment from marketing, can become the overarching or overriding measure, which can, if not done properly, can lead to short-term thinking. And so as a simple example, it might be that you are looking for the shortest path to a return from marketing investment. And that would lead you to investing more in demand, and maybe in the easiest demand motion out there, which would be going after your customer base, something you and I talked about prior. Whereas what might be important and strategic to the organization is to make sure that your brand and the awareness associated with that is growing. And so that's the sort of dilemma that you can fall into from a short-term versus a long-term thinking perspective. And it is important as marketers and marketing leaders that we figure out what's the right balance between those two.
Well, and it's interesting because to unpack what you said, there's a couple of things there. One is that what you set as that final metric can influence how you even approach the problem, right? So that setting the right metric is important, regardless of what it is. And two, what you're saying is that if you set the metric in a certain way, and in particular, if ROI, return on investment, right? Which makes sense why we'd want it, right? Because we can see there's a one-to-one correlation between I put this in, I get this out, I can justify it. If you're in business, it's a money-making machine. We put in X, we get out Y. We're making money, therefore we can do it infinitely. The problem with that is it could start to replace strategy. And why is that? So strategy, and why does that come to dominate strategy? How does that sort of, if you're not careful, start to influence all of your strategic thinking?
Yeah, and so It is. So marketing, and I often, say that marketing and the role of the CMO is one of the more complex. I have a ratio which I use, which is complexity to appreciation. I think as an executive, marketing has, and the marketing leaders have one of the highest complexity appreciation ratios out there.
You mean appreciation from like the organization, from everything of what you do and the complexity of what you...
Yeah, in terms of like recognition and in terms of understanding. So when you think about marketing, getting back to kind of your question, is like there's definitely a very data intense centric component. There's a technology stack. There is, psychographics and understanding your audience. There's aesthetics in terms of, brand and how you appear in the market. There are so many different strategic, obviously, choices that you make, and operational. So when you think of the breadth of marketing today, it's an incredibly complex function, and CMO is an incredibly complex role. And yet the recognition and understanding of how marketing works, because it has evolved so rapidly and so much over the last few years, is still low. And so one of the biggest roles of a CMO is actually in that communication and evangelization of the function, but communication and education, I would say, of the executive team, the rest of the organization, and the board. So back to your question, can the metrics jeopardize strategic thinking? And they absolutely can. So you said it well. The metric in some ways will determine your focus. So it's about framing the problem correctly. First of all, you need to understand what is it that you're ultimately trying to achieve as an organization, and really getting clear on those objectives. And so, what is most important? Is it most important that we get the most out of our customer base? Is it important that we grow market share or grow share of wallet? What are the ultimate objectives of the organization? That will then determine strategically. So number one, that will then determine what are the right metrics. And once you have the right metrics, then you can set about, what is the right strategy. And so, or the right approach to achieve those metrics and those objectives. And so I think that's where it starts.
Or put another way, it's not just this tension between strategy and metrics, but there's this other part that you mentioned, which is objectives. And so metrics measure how fast we're climbing the wall. Strategy, but also influenced by objective, determines, is the ladder up against the right wall to begin with?
Yeah.
And the problem is, and the problem is that if we just focus on essentially what is the most clear, what is the most direct way to measure how fast we're climbing the ladder, and that's ROI, do we just forget to think about if the ladder's on the right wall at all? And yes, we're climbing, but we're climbing to get to, a 2-story building, and we could be climbing to get to a 10-story building, but we're just not going to see that because it's easier to get to the 2-story building.
Yeah, and it's also, I think that the challenge, and I don't think anyone will get tired of us talking about metrics because it is so front and center of the CMO conversation. I think the challenge sometimes with the metrics is that there are certain metrics that are easier to measure, right? So in other words, it is easier to know that if you do a demand program and that you get a lead and it turns into an opportunity and a deal, that's clear. It is harder to know if you are, building a brand, what is the impact to the bottom line? And so the tendency can be, especially when budgets are tight, is to gravitate to the things that are easier to sort of draw the line between the investment and the return than things that are harder to measure. But it doesn't mean that they're less strategic. And that's kind of the dilemma, right? Is that you can, unless you've got back to the education, unless you've brought your board and your executive team and the company along and understanding and appreciating the importance of say building that brand, building the awareness, building a relationship, or building a community, then when push comes to shove, it's going to be hard to defend that spend because it's hard to show the direct correlation to the bottom line. Harder.
Well, sure. Well, and one, just to play devil's advocate here for a second. Some people listening to this may be saying, yes, I would love to not be so ROI driven, but we're in a downturn. Budgets are being cut. The future is uncertain. I'm seeing layoffs across the sector. Inflation's up. We came out of the pandemic and now we've got an economic crisis that everyone says is about to happen, and I've got to be conservative. What do you say to that, where the natural tendency is, I got to account for every dollar. Dollars are getting harder to come by. So let's, get really, really focused on ROI out of necessity.
Yeah. And so it is, it's a balance. Back to what we said earlier. It is a balance between the short-term, long-term, between the tactical and strategic, between what's, very easily measurable and what's harder to measure. So how do you strike that balance? First of all, it is back to what strategy are you going to try to do? Understanding the realities of the market today. So we are headed into, some would say we're already in a recession. So budgets are tighter. There is, concern out there. And so people are being more conservative in their spending. That's a reality, and we've got to deal with that reality. Now, given that reality, and like anything, one of my favorite books is Ryan Holiday's The Obstacle is the Way. So it's looking at an obstacle or a challenge and saying, how can we turn this around? How can we turn this into an opportunity? So knowing that most people are going to be cutting back, is this an opportunity for us to figure out a way to make sure that we don't over-index on cutting back marketing and keep the budgets right to where we can, so that we are growing our mind share in the market, because everyone else is pulling back on spend. So this is potentially an opportunity for us to become more present, because there's going to be less noise in the market. Now, doesn't mean that's going to be easy, and there's got to be a plan behind it. So how are you planning to achieve that? What are you going to do with the money? It doesn't mean that you're going to be reckless. But one of the ways that I would say, and we could talk about, this in more detail, I'll give a headline. One of the things I would be looking to do as we head into the downturn is how do I leverage the relationships I have in the market? That is obviously customers, that is channel or resell partners, that is a community, that is influencers that I have a connection to. Because that is one of the, in my view, one of the most efficient ways to, quote, spend your money, is leveraging the relationships, because that's where people are looking. They're looking to the industry luminaries or to their peers or to a community for information. And so that would be one of the things that I would look to invest in, that may not produce that immediate, obvious ROI, but strategically and long-term will absolutely build your presence in the market.
Well, and one of the things that is maybe underrated about a downturn, especially if you are not the market leader currently, is it tends to mix things up. It sort of changes the order. There's a lot of rooms to get shift. You can do what would take 5 years in a year, because there's just a lot of disorder, disruption, and no one wants to do. A stable base kind of tends to favor the status quo, right? Yep. A disruptive base tends to favor the challenger, right? Because there's a lot you can do. So there's opportunity. It was interesting. We did some analysis and some research looking at, after the sort of 2008, 2009 financial downturn, who are the companies that won in the next 10 years? What did they do? And usually it was that they invested in three things, and depending on the industry, in different ways. One was actually marketing. They took a longer term view. To your point, they saw it as an opportunity. Two was research and development. They actually invested more in research and development. There was a time for innovation. The market was disrupted anyway. We can actually play a slightly longer game as we look for what's next. And 3 was infrastructure. There were some interesting companies that were more manufacturing-based companies that like invested in plants, invested in manufacturing. They could get it at a bargain. They did that, and that fueled their growth. So
Right.
what do you think are possible drivers right now, as if you look at that, either the marketing mix or beyond? You mentioned one, which is relationships, either investing in them or harvesting them, right? Doesn't need to necessarily cost you a lot to set into motion that partnership you've cultivated for a couple of years and now say, let's come together in these times to do something else. What else should be part of that marketing mix?
So I think it starts with whatever the mix. I'll get to that in a minute, but whatever you're doing, it starts with your message to the market, and understanding, understanding what is it that your customers or the prospects or the market that you're targeting, what are their care abouts? And yes, that's true anytime, but I'd say especially true in a downturn where they're going to have some very clear priorities. What are the things that they're going to care about? And in the case of Gigamon, where I am right now, I know that our customers care, as most will, about cost efficiencies, for sure. And they will continue to care about hybrid multi-cloud security, because that's not going away. Attackers are going to take a break just because it has an economic downturn.
Sure.
So it's like understanding your audience, where they are, and making sure that your offering and the way you position your offering really hits home in their top priorities. And we're lucky enough that that's clearly the case. The second one is, in terms of the message, how you communicate, it's being empathetic to what they're dealing with. So I think the language we use and how we communicate is also really important. And that was one of the lessons we took away from the pandemic, is that you've got to be sensitive where people are, and coming across as too marketing-y in a challenging time actually backfires, right? And so we moved away from being, we moved away from sort of, talking about our great product to really trying to reach our audience and to say how, ask how we could help. And then the third,
and is that, and just to, before you continue on, just empathy, is that just understanding their situation? It's just, you don't hear that a lot in like cybersecurity, right? It's not necessarily meant to be your like most empathetic industry. So what is an example of that? Is it just simply putting yourself in their shoes and trying to sort of serve them first, then serve yourself, and making sure that's clear? Or is it something beyond that, of how in like a really technical, kind of hardcore field with lots of dangers and fear in the world, you can be empathetic?
Yeah. And so it's a great question, Ben. It really is. And this is taking the long-term view, is that if you take the long-term view, that genuinely, the belief is that if you are really going to try and help, that you will get, given you shall receive. But if you really are there trying to help, that, at some point that will come back to you. And so part of it is, I said, in how you communicate. And so we are very empathetic to our security audience, and say one of our key messages was recognizing SOC burnout, security operations burnout, which is real. They're understaffed, they're overworked, and it's a high pressure job. And so really trying to, recognize and appreciate the tough job that they have. And basically say, like, we're here to try and help, and we have different ways that we can do that. But that's our concern right now, is there's severe burnout and the problem's not going away. And so I think that's the big one. And I'd say it's building. You can't do that unless you're authentic, because people will know when you're doing it as a ruse to get them ultimately. And so you've got to figure out what is the, how can you do that in an authentic way? And I say it goes back to what we said earlier in the conversation. It is establishing the relationship with your community. It's giving back to the community, whatever it is, help, free software, free training, things that that you may have charged for in the past to build that relationship. And again, being true to who you are and what you represent in the market, I think is the other way that people can appreciate who you are, trust you, and then you have an opportunity to, I said, to kind of step in with them in their situation, be empathetic.
And so, to bring it full circle to the discussion about ROI and the alternative to that, which is, as you've written about in the past, return on objectives. Maybe in this situation, your objective, I mean, if it's purely ROI, you're like, how can I extract as much, US or foreign currency from my client base at this time so that I don't, miss my number. The return on objective might be, your objective might be, in this difficult time, we are in the business of making our customers successful. And we do whatever it takes to do that because that's just how we're oriented. And we'll do great business when our customers are successful and we're here in it with you. And if that is your objective, then maybe you measure that a little bit differently. Maybe that takes a slightly longer term view. Maybe you're more empathetic. And maybe that is a balancing factor with, of course, the ROI that you also have to meet as well.
Yeah. And so it doesn't mean, so absolutely agree, the sort of the getting clear on the, what are the objectives that you care about? And then, and making sure, again, the organization, starting with the executives and the board, are aligned around those objectives. Doesn't mean they can't be measured, right? So I think that's the thing, that sort of a return on objective is just that, is there is a way to measure how you're progressing against the objective. It just doesn't immediately tie to the bottom line like an ROI does. And I think that's where people can get caught up, is because, back to what I said earlier, is there are certain things that are easier to correlate with the bottom line, and people tend to gravitate towards those when budgets are tight, and that can lead to short-term thinking. And so it is part of our job as CMOs and as marketing leaders to make sure that we're helping the organization think through the long-term strategic, so that, as you said, in the case of these companies that you interviewed or researched, they come out stronger from challenging times, because you can only do that if you take the long-term view. If you take the short-term tactical view, you will make short-term tactical decisions and you will not come out stronger from this economic crisis.
Now, part of what makes a CMO different from just the head of marketing, SVP of marketing, global, top marketing person, is that there's some appreciation for, you're part of the executive team of the company at its highest level. So you're bringing your discipline expertise, but you're also helping navigate the overall direction of the company too, as part of that, as part of the C-suite. So one of the skills, maybe underrated, is rallying other members of the C-suite to your point of view or long-term thinking. And, the CFO may have different things he or she is measuring than you, and that may want him or her to push you towards ROI. The CEO may have a different point of view, and so forth down the line. So how do you rally people to that way of thinking when certainly it's more convenient? Sometimes it's easier to measure if we all just agree on ROI.
Yep. Yeah, it's a great question. I said it is in my view, one of the CMO's primary responsibilities is to bring the executive team and the board along this journey that marketing has been on for a number of years, on a transformation of marketing, in some ways accelerated by the pandemic and now being tested again in the economic downturn. And so I think part of it is, first of all, where appropriate, certainly explaining the measurement system and educating on the measurement system and showing predictable results, because that builds trust, right? And so what I said, and at Gigamon, we went on this journey where I started operating marketing more like sales, and I did it because it was an easier metaphor or approach or model for most of the executive team and the board to understand. That is that we have a target, we present a forecast, and we built a pretty innovative forecasting model. And then, monthly check-ins on where we are against our forecasts and our results. And these results are top to bottom and everything in between. And so building that kind of, just like sales, you got a target, you got a quota, you've got your forecast, and then you got your results. Building that and educating on how we were measuring and getting everybody aligned around the validity and in some ways taking that out so that was a third party that was measuring, it wasn't marketing reporting on itself. All of that built credibility. So having that credibility then in how we're operating our business and we're operating it efficiently then allowed us to have the conversation about the strategic longer term where it is less measurable, at least from an ROI perspective. But presenting again, what are the right metrics to measure the objectives and progress against the objectives? And so I think it is, again, sort of putting yourselves in the shoes of the other executives and what they care about and what's important to them and how they think. And at least from, my experience at Gigamon, operating more like the sales model in terms of how we report on our business has been helpful in building that trust and understanding that has then allowed me to have these more strategic conversations.
And how would you think about the lessons from the pandemic? You executed a pivot in the pandemic, which we can touch upon briefly. But how does that inform you now as we get to this new phase, which is not primarily pandemic sort of led, but more downturn or recession led as well? What do you take from sort of the struggles of the past 2 years that you apply to the next 2 years?
Yeah. So, looking at your marketing mix, and understanding the right mix to reach your audience, and how that continues to evolve. We obviously moved into a completely virtual world, and we're moving back to a hybrid world, and we're still learning. There's been some good innovation, but there's still more efficiencies, I think, to be gotten out of that. So what's the right marketing mix for your target audience, for your industry, for your offering? Back to what we talked about earlier, it really is learning to be empathetic to your audience and where they are. And so in the message and how you communicate, I think that's key. And building that trust through the relationships that you have with your customers, partners, community, ecosystem. Because at the end of the day, and the world is moving that direction. More and more of marketing, in my view, going forward will be word of mouth. It will be through a trusted, because we know that the buyer today, more and more of the B2B managers and employees are millennials. They, candidly prefer not to talk to a vendor. We've seen that in our data. They're okay to do a chat on a chat bot, but they're reluctant to talk to a salesperson unless, until it comes to the absolute must time. So they prefer to do their research online. It's been there, pre-pandemic. I think it accelerated in the pandemic. More and more of that buyer journey is online. And where do they go? They go to their trusted sources. That is peer site reviews, community, folks who will, quotes, talk independently, objectively about the offering and the company. And so I think investing in that word of mouth is going to be incredibly important going forward, because, as I said, that's the way modern marketing is going.
Well, and even something you said there, I think resonated with me in the relationships between tactics and strategies. And typically we have a strategy. It leads to a tactic to implement the strategy. But in times of turmoil or downturn, sometimes we can go the other direction, which is from a tactic that we sort of abstract into a greater strategy. And I'll give you an example. A lot of B2B companies are, have in-personing marketing components that are built on trade shows, conferences, relationships, meeting people in person. Maybe that channel is disrupted if it was in the pandemic, or there's less face-to-face interaction. So we need a strategy to continue to cultivate those relationships, because that's a driver of our business. Just the tactic may change. It might not be quite the same, effort and spend, to your marketing mix point, on trade show channel, but that doesn't replace the need for the relationships, because relationships drive our business. We just got to do it a different way tactically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would say that the relationship became even more important during the pandemic. And so it was the way that, though, you nurtured and grew that relationship, and gave in our case, it's a complex B2B technology infrastructure. And we wanted to, we wanted to take the buying experience as much as we could online. So we thought about, the way that buyers used to buy cars, go into your showroom and, look at the cars. And now more and more of that you can do online. You can kind of customize your car, and you can kind of take it for a drive nearly online. And so we did that that was one of the innovations for us anyway, that we did, because we're not an online application. We're a physical piece of hardware with cloud software now, but we brought that experience online. So it was one way to get closer to our buyer without having to meet them in person. So that's an example of kind of building on that relationship.
Absolutely. And I think this notion of, you mentioned innovation, and that being one of your innovations that you've done, is that it's also underrated that scarcity, whether that's money, whether that's customers, whether that's leads, is a driver of innovation. You have to figure out another way. And there's not too many companies that are sort of just like rich, fat, happy market leaders that are like super innovative, right? They don't have to be. They just have to reap their harvest. So looking for ways to do that, and to the point about, our obstacles, opportunities, could be really powerful. How much of your ability to see that is based on your background? If I was going to summarize it, it's not a traditional CMO background. You've had experience in product, as a general manager, in M&A. How does that give you a different viewpoint or perspective that might make you see more of those opportunities instead of obstacles?
Yeah, it's a good question. I hadn't really thought about how my background might play into it. I think back to one of our earlier points of conversation, I think my background certainly helps in my putting myself in the shoes of the other executives on what they care about. That for sure has helped there. In terms of innovation, I really do love this idea of like turning obstacles into opportunities. I think it's fascinating, because it's all about the growth mindset. If you're familiar with growth versus the fixed mindset, and sort of,
sure,
how do you reframe, back to what we said earlier, how do you reframe, like, if you reframe or a problem and think it through, I think that's kind of the beginning of it. Like, how do you think about the problem differently that can lead to these innovations? And so I think certainly having a technical background and then a general manager thinking about P&L does allow me to look at the problem maybe in a multi-dimensional way. Maybe that's part of it, but also, I've got to credit a great team of great marketers, in my case, Gigamon, that helped drive some of this innovation for the company.
Well, and looking back at your background, I mean, you have this sort of multifaceted background. You've also worked with some companies, I mean, generally technology companies, software companies, but they've had some unique challenges and opportunities based on where they were in the ecosystem. So I'd love to ask you about some of those, and what you take with you to your work with Gigamon today. So first, we could start out with some of the, I guess I'd say it is like open source based companies that were commercializing products based on that. I'm talking about a Jaspersoft or a DataStax that, were based on that. What do you take now, even though you're not at a company like that at the moment? How does that sense of knowledge and community influence you now?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and the one of the things that we took directly to Gigamon from those companies was community, and so we were enterprise B2B. There was no open source component to what we did, and there isn't today either. However, the importance of building community around our offering was something that we started here at Gigamon a few years ago, and that community has grown quite substantially since we put it in place. And I said it's become kind of the trusted source for both our customers as well as prospects who go and ask questions and get answers and kind of get a sense of the offering, the company, its values, and how responsive it is. So that was one for sure that I took away from it. I think the other is really you can have great technology, but ultimately what is going to win you a customer base and market share is providing a great solution to customers' problems. And so, in the open source world, it is very much, the way these projects start, it's a piece of technology that does something and it's kind of thrown out there, and sometimes it grows, sometimes it doesn't. But ultimately, the successful companies that come at that figure out how to build a solution to a critical customer problem. And that involves just more than technology, but everything that you wrap around it, from the documentation to the services to the support to the customer success. And so really taking a solution focus to helping our customers, in our case now, getting their arms around security and compliance in the hybrid and multi-cloud, which is a journey they're all on and they're all trying to figure out, is kind of where we're really focused now, is helping them in that really challenging journey. So solution focus and community-based approach.
And what do you take from the other side of the coin in your background, which is the companies that were based on enterprise sales, whether that's certainly, back further in your career, the SAPs of the world, TOPCMO, others.
Yeah.
You're at another company oriented towards that now. How are you more efficient or effective in your role now than you were when you were newer in that type of role?
Yeah. So I think it is at the collaboration at the executive level. There is no, if any organization today operates as siloed functions, they're not going to be successful. And so we have a very strong culture at Gigamon. We call the One Gigamon culture, or a franchise approach, where it is very much it's a team. In the case of especially on the go-to-market, sales, marketing channel, that are operating together with a common objective. And so having that very tight alignment, common shared goals, very clear and open and authentic communication. I think that is probably one of the things that certainly I have put a lot more emphasis on, and I believe matured towards, is that cross-functional peer-to-peer collaboration at the executive level. That would be certainly one of them. I think the other is how do you sort of being efficient from a marketing perspective. So this conversation we started around ROI is being as efficient and as accountable as possible with the money that we were given. And so the way that I talk back to the franchise, the way I talk to my sales counterparts around marketing is, we are the stewards of the investment on your behalf. So we are the experts. We kind of know, what works and what doesn't. And, we're willing obviously to take a perspective on it, but we're kind of the stewards of that investment on your behalf. And so we try to be as efficient as possible, and they understand that we get measured on outcomes. And so once you get them in part of that process, then they're engaged and they have skin in the game because they know that you're doing this on their behalf. And so getting very efficient and accountable with your investment is another thing that I believe is something that I've picked up or I've evolved since my time at SAP and TOPCMO.
And so to sum up, you've got to stay focused on the long term, but you can't ignore the short term. You've got to be empathetic to your customer, but you can't forget, other colleagues and your executives and your board. You've got to be strategic, yet you've got to be tactical. Is this just an impossible job? How do you do all of those things? Who are the CMOs that you admire? And just to wrap up, how does one do this job when there's so many conflicting priorities and considerations?
Yeah, it is the CMO role is, and I said I've had the benefit of running other functions, so I can have a outsider perspective. Is one of the more challenging roles for sure. I think it's got I have a ratio, we talked about it earlier, sort of complexity to appreciation ratio, which is, it's a very complex role, but not well necessarily recognized or understood. And so, to your point, I think the role requires a balance, and that balance is important. Like everything in life, balance is important. It leads to good outcomes, and so the balance between the long term, the short term, strategic, tactical, are things that the CMO needs to manage every day. And at the same time, I think it is a very interesting role. I think it's a role that is can be very, very rewarding because it's the tip of the spear of many companies. Creating new markets, as we're doing right now at Gigamon with deep observability, could be a very interesting and challenging journey to go on. And so, HBR wrote an article that there's no one type of CMO. There's like maybe three. They had 3 flavors of CMOs, and that may be true, depending on the life cycle of the company, and you got to know kind of what type of CMO you want. But whatever type of CMO you are, I think that balance that we talked about is core. In terms of who I admire, I think there are in the I can talk about the sort of the marketing. I think there's all the great companies that we know and we love from a marketing perspective. What I love about them, and I'll say the obvious, Apple is the sort of the clarity of what they represent. And this is one company that has continued to do well, even in challenging times, because they are obsessed about their customer and delivering an incredible product and not doing it in a way, and doing it in a way that is very distinctive. If you think back to their Think Different campaign, that's exactly, they are very clear and they have a great message to the market. And so, look, Ben, I think this is these are going to be challenging times for CMOs, for marketers. And as you said, I think it will be important to find that balance for your organization and helping them navigate and not lose sight of and think of yourself as a representative of the long term, because I think that is in many ways marketing is the counterbalance to the short-term tactical, is to maintain that long-term focus.
According to Karl Bergh, it's easy to get caught up in the metrics of the moment. So don't lose sight of the bigger picture. Find that delicate balance between meeting the immediate needs of the business and planning for the long term. Stay laser focused on your objectives. Maybe the objective is developing strong relationships. If in-person marketing tactics no longer are feasible, continue to build those relationships by developing other tactics. Downturns can also present opportunities. Mix things up, try new approaches. Sometimes, as a CMO, the downturn is what you need to galvanize support, to try something outside of the box. Build strong relationships with customers, partners, and other stakeholders. It's valuable in times of uncertainty and incredibly useful as you come out the other side. Find that sweet spot where you can survive the present, but continue to lay the foundation for the future. For TOPCMO, I'm Ben Kaplan.